Hello everyone! Welcome to the video. We are Group 4 and this is our critical report about the module Modernity Intensifying from the course titled The Contemporary World.
This module discusses the ways by which the social, economic, political, and cultural processes of modernity are globally integrated and interdependent. It looks at the consolidation and transformation of modernity's institutions, such as the mass media, cities, and the nation-state. The rapidly increasing mobility of the population is a central aspect of the widespread occurring social transformation in Southeast Asia. In each country, the tendency is to blame our history, our populists, our media, our institutions, and our lousy politicians. And it is predictable, since the foundation of political consciousness, public education, and mass media emerged in the 19th century from a globe-conquering ideology of unique national destinies. The most momentous development of our era, precisely, is the waning of the nation-state. Its inability to withstand the countervailing 21st century forces, and its calamitous loss of influence over human circumstance. Consequently, it has been argued that the nation-state is now increasingly intersected and disrupted not only by new global reaches of late capitalism and the increased role of international organizations such as the UN, IMF, World Bank, and WTO. It is further intersected by new social movements based on gender, ethnicity and religion, concern for the local community and the environment, all demanding for autonomy. On account of the new intersections, the nation-state itself is increasingly being displaced as the point of reference for societies in late modernity. Western people have acquired greater benefits from globalization. However, in less developing countries, specifically Southeast Asia, where neoliberal globalization, though promoting growth, has resulted in much inequality.
And with this, our group presents our problem statement, which is that the agricultural sector, specifically farmers, continue to be labeled and stigmatized as unimportant despite the dependence of the country on agriculture due to society's perception of infrastructure development and business management as indicators of progress. As a result, farmers do not receive proper compensation and are heavily affected by social inequalities caused by the divide between the socioeconomic classes intensified by globalization.
Land reform is among the many concepts extensively modified by new economic systems and frameworks brought about by intensified globalization. Land reform, as defined by Tuma, is a purposive change in the way in which agricultural land is held or owned, the methods of cultivation that are employed, or the relation of agriculture to the rest of the economy. Reforms such as these may be proclaimed by a government, by interested groups, or by revolution. The Philippines, being an agricultural country, has had land reform as one of the longest ongoing socio-economic issues ever since the pre-Spanish colonial era. The transition from colonialism to short-lived independence to neo-colonialism has unfortunately left the state of these reforms in tatters and even proved to be disadvantageous to its supposed beneficiaries. One way in which land reforms in the Philippines have been affected by intensified globalization is how the government prioritizes economic growth, particularly in the country's gross domestic product or GDP. This led to the government calling upon both local and foreign investors from the private sector to promote economic development, encouraging them through incentives and privileges. However, in doing so, the government permitted the privatization of vast hectares of land and its ownership was attributed to private individuals and corporations. Farmers who relied on these lands as a means of existence became tenants who were at their landlord's mercy. As the economy boomed, due partly to the private sector encroaching on agricultural lands, inequalities started to reveal themselves in both urban and rural societies through the privatization of social life. Emma Porio noted that while continued economic growth and rising prosperity have led to poverty reduction, social inequality has widened within and across income groups or classes, as well as compromised the integrity of ecological environmental systems. And through the Land Gini Index, it was determined that the Philippines is among the highest in Asia in terms of land inequality. With this, the government addressed land reform issues by writing and legislating laws, one of which is the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Law of 1988. This law aimed to transfer productive agricultural land from landlords to tenants, but this unfortunately resulted in the increased land conversion of productive agricultural land to non-agricultural uses, as landlords sought to avoid redistribution. The municipal and local elite were also able to reclassify agricultural lands for real estate speculation and industrial and commercial enclaves with the passing of the 1991 Local Government Code, which was intended to be a decentralization measure. Porio went on to attribute rising inequality in part to an economy heavily dependent on services, real estate, and commercial development. Due to this, households headed by Filipino farmers, forestry workers, and fishermen in rural areas continually experience chronic poverty. These Filipinos are constantly deprived of both stable employment opportunities and effective political participation. Lastly, these inequalities are exacerbated by the poor's exposure and vulnerability to climate-related hazards like typhoons and floods, which often lead to disasters.
Thank you very much for that, Neil. Now let us move on with how do we address the problem. Before anything else, let us first lay out the foundations on which our analysis will rely on. Just a very quick definition of terms so that we have an understanding on what we are discussing. Firstly, capitalism, according to Mark Brechet, is a socio-economic system in which goods and services are produced and traded in a free market, in which the means of production are privately owned. Thus, laborers are working for wages in order to produce said goods and services. Secondly, Marxism is primarily a critique of capitalism in relation to how the laborers, or in this case the proletariat, are abused by people in power and their relationships effect on the market. Lastly, globalization is the international transport of goods, stock, ideas, and everything that can be considered as a product or service. Let it be known that from here on out, we address our problem through the lens of Marxism. This means to say that how globalization renders agriculture as unimportant explained through Marxism. Okay, now that's done, let's move on with it. Globalization, as in said in papers such as Sherong's work, argued that Marx's ideas viewed globalization as capitalism, reaching international borders, meaning that countries are now trading with each other across nations, establishing connection and interdependence. With this, developing countries are encouraged to look desirable to foreign investors. This entails progress being measured in GDPs, or numbers on a screen, or stock on television. But how does someone without backing in finance and business see progress? This is interpreted differently across nations and cultures, but for the most part, it is the infrastructure projects in the country which leads to city-centric economics and rapid urbanization. With the appeal of foreign work comes demand, and demand, as we know, is eventually filled with supply. So for skills, it is often that high enough education and a certain aptitude for the English language is valued higher than other skills or job. In our case, it is regarded higher than the agricultural work. With this, economy becomes city-centric, and the privately owned lands are now more inclined to turn lands into real estate or for commercial purposes. Indeed, the government has tried to find ways to redistribute agricultural land from the landlords to the laborers in the field. However, as Kielo put it, those in economic power have the tendency to also hold political power here in the Philippines, which means that they will find, or they themselves will make loopholes around these redistribution efforts in order to preserve or amass more wealth. The major loophole for this redistribution of land is that the labeling of land to be non-agricultural, which makes it ineligible for agrarian reform. With this in mind, we can now see that the wealth inequality in the Philippines is growing day by day. Slowly, and one can even argue that it is at an alarming rate, the rural rates of the country are being neglected or being transformed into urban areas themselves. This disregard for the people outside the cities are in negative feedback loop with the current socio-economic and political status quo of the Philippines. This privatization of goods, services, and other neoliberal economic policies have exposed the inequality and hierarchy in the Filipino society. This collection of privatized goods and services makes it so that the companies and their shareholders are growing richer day by day. And in response, the people that are forced to pay for basic goods and services are purged of hard earned money, drop after drop of water, and other basic needs. In relation to this, The privatization and transformation of lands makes it so that the agricultural sector of our country is left to corporations once again instead of laborers themselves owning the lands that they till. This is the first and the tangible manifestation of inequality in our agricultural sector. The lands that are used to produce food for the country are not even owned by the people who work on it, but are instead owned by the people in higher power who did not even touch a single particle of soil in their life. Now, since there is tangible proof, let us touch the intangible part. It was earlier mentioned that due to the globalization of the market, skills such as proficiency in the English language or college degree or anything that can help in selling a product rather than producing it seems to be held at a higher standard. Due to this, agricultural work is often stigmatized and stereotyped as a job for people that are not financially well off. We say this to comply with YouTube standards. But anyway, if you're not in the city, you're not going to receive any of the services and goods that are being offered in order to meet your basic human needs. Neoliberal education systems are also found in the cities, and the students in rural areas don't often receive quality education, at least to the metric of neoliberal economic policies due to the lack of funding, lack of teachers, and a combination of a lot more factors. As labor, you're more likely to earn a wage to buy products when you're busy convincing other people to buy this product rather than to work for a company to make that certain product. Our political and economic policies also do little to protect our agricultural workers from exploitation, nor does it give incentive to our workers for being in the sector itself. It seems that the stigma runs deep, as being in the agricultural sector is viewed as a curse, and that can be liberated by education and being marketable to international market, which might be the reason for the brain drain in our country, but that's for another topic. So, there we have it. The tangible and intangible inequalities in our agricultural sector. One is the lack of agrarian reform due to the chokehold of the landlords on their lands. Another would be the inequality between the rural and urban populations through metrics such as services and education. Finally, how these inequalities fuel stigma and stereotype, which cannot be solved by education systems of the country due to it being deeply rooted in the psyche of the population and the education system itself being afraid of radical change. So, do we have a way to solve this? Indeed, we have. Cielo mentioned that economic powers have an obligate political power. This follows that they have the capacity to make their own laws that are in favor of them, and not the worker, or at the very least, influence the lawmaking body of the government to produce laws and policies that are in favor of making profit on a corporate scale rather than to protect its laborers. And in this, our solution lies. However, we will first mention the pitfalls of this solution. Kielo also mentioned in her paper that liberal middle class representation of the people is a bad thing, as this is how class differences are legitimized and manifested into reality, as the messiah complex of the middle class is on full display. But how do we go around this? Well, she also mentioned one of the methods that non-governmental organizations or NGOs did, or at least in theory they did. Grassroots education. We need to make the people understand in a non-savior complex way that change can happen if they act. Change in the social, political, and economic status quos are within their reach, if only they are to reach out to it. With the changes coming from the people themselves and not from the top of the triangle, trickling down in the hopes that the people of the lower echelon will feel it, the foundations of modern society can be shook and even remade into something that is better, something that is deeply rooted in well-being of the community, rather than the exchange of goods. But it is not an overnight task, of course. It perhaps may be a series of struggles and victories to change our reality, but the point stands that it must come from the proletariat, from the laborers, from themselves, from ourselves. To give a relevant example, we actually saw a glimpse of this in the pink movement last election campaign. Feels weird to say it. Anyway, whereas other people, other candidates tried to use their connections, tried to use their names, Lenny Robredo's support came from the people themselves. People taking it to the streets and talking to their fellows about her platforms, advocacies, and plans for the country. Although in the end, it might have fallen to the tendencies of the middle class to be the messiah in this case. But there was a time in this campaign where the middle and the lower class and their divisions ceased to exist. They worked together to bring forth a change in their country, in our country, and that is promising enough for Inanga.
Moving on to the critique of our module. First, we greatly appreciated the inclusion of the Philippine perspective through Dr. Ricky Abad's lecture, the article on learning poverty, and Porio and Chelo's works, which served as the highlights of the discussion board and two reading seminars in Module 4. With the exception of Modules 1 and 3, most modules were centered on international perspectives and contexts. Although this was to be expected, as mentioned in Module 3, there is a global division of labor in the social sciences due to access to resources, skills, and even the community's interest in social issues. Exploring modernity through the lens of Filipinos undoubtedly helped make the module much more interesting, insightful, and most of all, relevant and relatable. Dr. Ricky Abad's lecture opened our eyes to the importance of education and its role in trends within demographics such as world population, income, GDP per capita, human capital, and learning outcomes. Following this, we learned about the incidents and implications of learning poverty in the Philippines and the burden it places on teachers to split their duties as educators and administrators. Through the discussion board on learning poverty, not only were us students able to synthesize the context behind gaps between different countries in light of intensifying modernity, but also apply what we've learned thus far in developing feasible and informed recommendations for the education system. This newfound perspective on factors influencing social inequality within the country and even between developed and developing countries was further enriched by Christina Cello's work on social inequalities and political organizations, such as the hierarchy of labor produced by an uneven education system, leading to the devaluation of agriculture as we try to keep up with the world and the prioritization of skill-oriented occupations. This was supported by Emma Porio's Disaster Risk and Climate Change Focus on Inequality, exploring how inequality worsens the impact of climate change and disasters, especially for people in the lower echelons of Philippine society. Overall, we believe that this module was well structured and organized. It provided substantial context, thought provoking references, room for discourse and application, and points of reflection that aided us in investigating the impacts of social inequality on local communities, especially the agricultural sector.
Right, so now we'll be discussing the insights and main takeaways from our readings. For so long, poverty has been one of the biggest problems we face. Not only in the Philippines, but poverty is experienced by over a quarter of the global population. Globalization has a huge influence on the economic growth of countries. Hence, attracting other countries for trade requires a better quality of education and more infrastructure projects in the country. Through public private partnerships, large development projects were funded by private sectors. Supposedly, the world trading system brought upon by globalization should help spread the wealth among the nation. As the urban and capitalist development intensifies, the gap between the poor and rich becomes wider. As the economy grows, the marginalized communities are left to be displaced and neglected as a result from privatization of the goods and services. As mentioned in Porter's article, high-end residential areas are located alongside informal settlements. Even upgraded informal settlement sites are occupied by private sectors, leaving the marginalized communities to live in areas not suitable for habitation. In the agricultural sector, lands used for agriculture are left to be in the hands of corporations instead of farmers themselves. Not only so, the laborers struggle with the stereotypes and stigmas as a result of social inequality. Initially, the land reforms were for economic growth, but with continued economic growth and rising prosperity led to a widening gap between the rich and the poor with intensive capitalist development. Thus, in addition, To the new perspective this module provided on inequalities in the country, especially with regard to the agricultural sector, its main takeaway is that the intensification of globalization and modernity help society realize their rights, and how unfair systems, oppressive practices, and harmful stereotypes and ideologies prevent us from receiving the rights that we deserve. Thank you for listening. This module has been presented to you by Group 4.